Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on cycling. I'm Marianne Horn. I am the staff liaison for the Community Advisory Committee, and I'm glad to see everybody here, especially our new members. I was just checking the participants list to see we have um, among our new members, we have Adam and Amy and Clyde, John and Sheba and Torin. Thank you all for coming. This is wonderful. And we have with us today, leading today's webinar is our resident expert on all things cycling, Mr. Mike Wilson from our planning staff. Also, I'm happy to see Judy Piso, our vice chair, is with us, as well as David Sabila and Mark Bolton, members of the committee, and we are expecting maybe a couple more to join us, but we're sending this to YouTube so everybody um, can watch it again or watch it later or share it with a friend. We've had some interest from other committees. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and get started. And please, we want this to be fairly informal. This is not, a regular meeting. There's no business to conduct. This is this is a time to take a deep dive and to really take advantage of having Mike with us, and we can talk about cycling. So just to set the stage, Mike is going to talk about geographic, land use, and demographic factors that figure into the choice that people make to whether or not they're going to bike. And then we're going to look at some factors that affect our bicyclist crash risk and talk about the behaviors that contribute to that, and how those risks play out. After that, Mike is going to explain some more about speed, just as with other forms of transportation. Speed and cycling is an issue and a factor that we need to understand, both from an engineering perspective and also from a user perspective. And then we're going to talk about the factors that we can improve, what we can do. We know that we must reduce cyclist fatalities and serious injuries on our roads. We're hard at work on that on a number of fronts, including our Vision Zero program. But this is a great chance for us to really understand this issue and to take it out into the community. So we will pause throughout for some feedback and questions. And so feel free, but I'm gonna turn it over to Mike now. And we feel free if you want to raise your hand if you have a question. I think he has some natural pauses built in throughout for questions. If there's something that you feel is better to write down, you can write it in the chat. But we should be in an atmosphere here, I think, with the size group where we can just chat. So anyway, take it away, Mike, and let's see what we can find out.
Well, thank you, Marianne, and good morning, everyone. One other little housekeeping thing. There are a number of you over on the attendee side, and you've probably received a prompt to be promoted to a panelist. So if you want to speak, just accept that prompt. During the presentation, if you could just keep yourself muted, and then unmute when we get to the Q&A discussion sections, and that would work best. So yes, our agenda today, which Marianne went over, have 4 sections to it, and there'll be a Q&A section after each one of those, so we have opportunity to discuss it while it's still fresh, because there's a lot to cover. And I want to talk a little bit about myself first. I have been using bicycle for transportation, believe it or not, for over 50 years. I started when I was 10 years old with my first paper route, and I've been biking to just about every job I've ever held, at least once or twice a week over those years. And so I've got a lot of real world experience there, over 150,000 miles. And then I've been at this for over 30 years doing bicycle and pedestrian planning. And when I started in this role, it was primarily on education. starting off with the Florida Traffic and Bicycle Safety Education Program, which focused on elementary school students. And then I became a league cycling instructor. That's the League of American Bicyclists, their national program. And then I helped co-develop another cycling education program called Cycling Savvy with a friend here from Orlando back in 2010. And something I've been doing here at Metroplan for nearly 30 years that's really helped me to understand this problem is what we call bicyclist crash typing, and I'll be getting into that. And it's a very important component of the planning process and understanding how to solve for safety. All right, so let's start off with that first section about bicycling for transportation. And one of the questions that has come up from the committee in prior meetings was, let's talk about the difference between biking for recreation and for transportation. Well, I like to think of it this way, is that cycling for transportation is biking to go somewhere, whereas cycling for recreation is going somewhere to bike. And sometimes that somewhere is just a route, just an enjoyable route, but it's basically without the destination is secondary. And it's really focused on selecting a route that's based more on comfort and scenery, whereas transportation is focused more on the distance and the access, minimizing the trip distance and improving your access. But regardless of what your trip purpose is, the same rules of movement apply, the same human factors apply. And physics doesn't change just because your trip purpose has changed. I'm going to start off talking about geography, and I like to make this comparison of the city of Amsterdam and the city of Orlando, because I can't think of more two divergent places in the world when it comes to cycling. And note here that I'm just looking at the municipal boundaries. It gets a lot more difficult if you try to do the metro area. But you look at the density of Amsterdam, it's 5 times denser than the city of Orlando. And the longest trip you would be taking would be in the range of about 7 miles. Whereas in Orlando, it could be double that. And what that means when you get down to the ground is that if you look at typical bicycle trip, which is in the Netherlands, it's only about 1.5 miles. Look at what the land use looks like 2 miles from the city center of Amsterdam, the density that we have there. And this is a residential street that you see. Whereas look at the street 2 miles from the center of Orlando. So, right there, we've just got a lot more people that are within easy biking distance of key destinations. And then a really important factor is transit. This is a bicycle parking garage in Amsterdam. It's right next to their main train station, right in the center of town, and also the ferry terminal. So if you think about what distance those trains are going, that if you didn't have the transit, how many of these bicycle trips would happen? A lot of those bicycle trips would disappear because the transit bicycle combination is so powerful. I'm going to bring it back to the Orlando area and look at some of the data that we've been collecting. We use a camera system called MyoVision, which has allowed us to do bicycle and pedestrian counts. And we've got close to 100 locations now, but I'm just looking at 80 locations where we're looking at bicycling along a roadway, whether it's a street without any bike facility or one with a bike lane or a side path.
Hey, Mike.
And you see here, yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Are you sharing your screen? Are there visuals? I'm not seeing a shared screen. I wasn't sure if you're sharing visuals or not.
Is anyone else having an issue with my screen?
No, I see it. This is Judy.
You see it? Okay. All right. It must
You
just
may
be on
need
my
to
end.
check your view, David, because I think that
And I don't use Zoom all that often anymore, so I apologize, everyone. Sorry to interrupt.
okay.
Okay, no problem. All right, so so as you can see here, the bicyclist mode share for these corridors where we've done counts, it doesn't really vary a great deal. Anywhere from 70 without a bike facility up to 88 with one. So not huge differences. Now, what we're not looking at here is the land use, and that can also have a really important impact on the amount of bicycle use. And we're collecting some more data on that to get a better picture of that, because if you have, let's say, a commercial corridor, you're going to expect to see a lot more bicycle use there, particularly the lower income cyclists who have to go to work there, more likely to be on a road like that than to be on a road that's primarily residential. And we can also look at the impact of bikeways over time. We have data from the US Census, the journey to work data, giving us the bicycle commute rate going back to 1990. You can see the numbers there for Metro Orlando, a little over 0.5%. And in 1990, we had virtually zero in the way of bike facilities. There was one or 2 miles of bike lanes, and that's about it. Today, we have well over 600 miles of bike lanes and over 200 miles of shared use paths. And yet our bicycle mode share has actually gone down, at least from a bicycle commute rate standpoint. This doesn't tell us what's going on with other trip types, but you kind of have to ask the question, why did commuting go down when we've done so much to increase bicycle facilities? Well, our land use has gotten more and more sprawling over those years. Most of the development over these past 30 years has been out in the outlying areas, very low density with longer trip distances. What about other cities? Now, there's a lot going on this slide, so let me walk you through things. First off, this uses a bicycle network score developed by People for Bikes. People for Bikes is a bicycle industry advocacy group, and they put together this bicycle network score to see how cities are doing from the standpoint of providing for bicycles. The network score is very similar to what we did for our active transportation plan. And it has 2 key components to it. One is the accessibility. How close are your normal destinations, whether it's work, shopping, parks, et cetera, getting to that geography aspect to it. And then the other side of it is, what is the road environment like? What's the level of comfort based on bike facilities, traffic volumes and speeds, and things of that nature. So these are the top 10 cities on their bicycle network score. And you can see too, when you look down that list of cities, most of these are known for having very extensive bicycle networks, bicycle facility networks. And so I took that census data for bicycle commute rates from 2017 and from 2022, 5-year spread. And we actually see that most of these cities actually saw a decline in bicycle transportation, in bicycle commuting, in spite of that investment. A couple of cities, San Francisco and New York, saw increases, but on the whole, we saw a decline. Now I'm going to bring in Orlando, which is not in the top 10, but just so you can see by comparison, Orlando's score and a similar drop in bicycle commute rate. So let's go over those transportation factors that I kind of hinted at or covered some of them. The density and the mix of uses. If we can get trip distances under 2 miles or under 20 minutes, we're going to see a lot more bike traffic. Street connectivity feeds into that. If you've got a good connected grid, that reduces your trip distance, and it also allows cyclists to avoid traveling on busy arterials. They can use parallel routes that are quieter and feel safer. Automobile parking supply. This is something that the Dutch particularly noted in some of their planning documents. And we see it in the US as well, places where parking is either expensive or hard to come by. You're going to see more cycling. And the flip side of that is actually providing better bicycle parking as well. In New York City, for example, used to have a big problem with bicycle theft, and that actually was a big deterrent for bicycle commuting. Well, they've since, about 10 years ago, required businesses, commercial buildings, to allow bicycles inside, which has greatly reduced that theft risk. College-age population. When I started in this job, there was paper planning documents about bicycling, talking about how college towns were always the most, saw the most bicycle traffic, and that continues to be true. And I did some analysis on that, looking at cities that had higher levels of college age residents, and you see a significantly higher bicycle commuting in those areas. Income, not surprisingly, is also a significant factor. Humidity, right? Here we are in the humid South. That really does have an effect. I took a look at some climate data and compared the commute rates for cities based on that, and the Western cities with their drier climates have twice as much on average. And then another factor it's hard to quantify is the terrain. Places with hilly terrain can discourage some trips, but then you see places like San Francisco and Seattle, which are both pretty hilly. There are ways to work around that, but it certainly does play a role in discouraging some trips. All right, so that's the end of our first section. If we had any questions or discussion, I think did Judy have something?
In the chat, it's just kind of a trivial question, trivia question. Age range of active cyclists, Europe being a very active cyclist continent versus what we might see here locally. I mean, obviously you see folks in the older range here, but are we really truly using the bicycles as a means of mode of transportation, as you might see in Europe? And in Europe, obviously, you're going to have the mass transit to support somebody riding their bike 2 miles to the train station versus us here, where for me, it would be 5 miles. So
Well,
go ahead.
we
I'm
don't
sorry.
really have good data on that. I think if you start slicing down into narrower bands of demographics, such as age, the numbers are so small in the census that it becomes pretty unreliable. I mean, they're very small to begin with.
Like I said,
So
it was just a trivia
Right.
question.
Right. All right. Anyone else who has a question, just go ahead and jump in. And
Mike, I think let's see, Mark Bolton had put something into the chat too about dry weather versus humidity, and certainly humidity is a factor in Central Florida.
right. Yeah. My commute is just at 2 miles. If it was any longer, I would need a full change of clothes, but 2 miles is the warm-up range. And that's why that 2 miles is so important. So even in cooler weather, once you get past 2 miles, that's when your body is really warmed up and starts to generate sweat. And adding humidity to that, it definitely makes it more of a challenge.
Just a small question. Does Sunrail allow bikes on it?
Yes, it does.
Okay, perfect.
And I'm not sure that we have any data from Sunrail as to the amount of bike use, if they're tracking that. It'd be good to know, but we haven't seen that.
And if, for people who aren't as familiar with Sunrail, we often see the images of those upper level seats with the tables and seats and so forth. So it doesn't look like there's a place, or would be a place to put a bike there. But on the first level of the train, it's a much different setup with seats along the side and room there where the bicycles can go on. And certainly I have seen people with bikes on Sunrail. It works pretty easily to get them on and off.
Right, there's room for 2 bikes right next to the door, but then also many of those seats fold up to accommodate either bicycles or for people with wheelchairs and other mobility devices. All right, well, if there's no one else, I will move on to our next section to talk about bicyclist risk factors. As I mentioned, we do the crash typing. We have over 10 years worth of that data, not only for bicyclists, but for pedestrians as well. So 800 or 900 crashes per year for both for bicyclists and for pedestrians. So a very rich data source. And then we have our MyoVision counts, which we've been doing since 2019. These are 48-hour video counts that we put primarily at mid-block locations, so we can just kind of get an idea generally across the region what the counts are. We're not looking so much for turning movements and such, just for overall numbers. But one of the things we're able to do with MyoVision is count bicyclists not only on the sidewalk or on a path, but in the roadway as well. So we can differentiate between someone who's in a travel lane, a bike lane, sidewalk, or a side path. And again, so these are the data points that we can analyze. So having exposure data from the MyoVision really helps us to understand the risk of different crash types based on the area characteristics and the bicyclist characteristics and behaviors. Before I get into crashes involving motor vehicles, we also need to think about crashes that don't involve motor vehicles. We've got data from the Florida Injury Surveillance System showing for our metro area that close to 3/4 of cyclist ER visits don't involve a motor vehicle. That probably wouldn't be very surprising, right? Little bumps and bruises, scrapes, etc. But even hospital admissions, right? Something serious enough where you need to be admitted to the hospital, over half of those admissions do not involve a motor vehicle. So what sort of things can contribute to that? Well, surface hazards, pavement problems, obstacles, anything that's protruding upward, posts, poles, benches, etc. Mechanical issues on the bike, crashes between cyclists, crashes with pedestrians, animals, primarily dogs, and then sometimes it's just poor bike handling skills. And none of these are going to show up in our crash data because if there's not a motor vehicle involved, it's very rare that we see a crash report for those types of incidents. So let's look at the risk factors for bicycle crashes. The first and foremost is conflict frequency. 95% of our crashes involve turning and crossing movements, either the bicyclist or the motorist violating the right of way of the other. And so most of our crashes would be happening at intersections and at driveways where you have those crossing movements. Motor vehicle volumes. If you reduce the number of cars, that's going to just reduce the overall risk. And we actually saw this play out during COVID. There was a big drop in automobile traffic. And even though cycling increased because we saw people going to the bike shops and getting as many bikes as they could, and the trails were busy, and crashes went down. And it was because of the reduced motor vehicle exposure. And then we have motor vehicle speed. Well, this gives us the increased risk for the cyclist crossing the road, similar to the way it does for pedestrians, that where you have higher speed, it increases both the risk and the severity. And then it also increases the risk for the overtaking motorist crashing. We'll dive into that a little deeper in a bit. Cyclist direction is extremely important. We found through our data that cycling facing traffic, and whether that's on a sidewalk, the roadway, a bike, doesn't matter. If you're adjacent to the road or on the road going against the flow of traffic, it increases your risk 5-fold compared to going with the flow. And the risk is because of the turning and crossing movements, where the motorists are looking in the opposite direction. They're looking where vehicles are coming from, and the bicyclist is coming from the opposite direction. And then bicycle speed, this is the underappreciated factor, risk factor. If a motorist violates your right of way, the faster you're going on a bike, the more stopping distance you're going to need. So the slower cyclist is actually at lower crash risk in many cases. Then we get the cyclist lateral position. What do I mean by that? Well, I look at it as three basic positions, one which I call adjacent, where the bicyclist is either on a sidewalk or a side path or a separated bike lane. There's some sort of vertical separation or grass separation between the cyclist path and the roadway. Then there's the edge position, where the cyclist is riding along the right-hand edge of a travel lane or in a bike lane, which are functionally the same. And then there's what I call driver position, where the bicyclist is actually in the center, near the center of the lane. And so those factors, or that factor, is highly dependent on the other factors. They can increase or decrease the risk depending on the other factors. And then finally, visibility and conspicuity. By visibility, I'm not talking about just the, say, light versus dark, but also how about the line of sight? Do you have sight obstructions, et cetera? And then conspicuity is the characteristics of the bicyclist. Are they using lights or reflectors at night? What kind of clothing are they wearing? And so that is a multiplier for all the other factors that, for instance, darkness combined with speed, with motorist speed, is a very profoundly important combination. With the crash typing, what's really important to understand is that we're looking at the factors that contribute to crashes. We're not assigning fault per se. Sometimes that's inherent. But for example, the fault could change based on the bicyclist's position. If a cyclist is going against the flow of traffic on the roadway, the bicyclist on the roadway has the same rights and duties as a driver of a vehicle. And so they'd be at fault for going against the flow of traffic. Whereas if the same bicyclist was on the sidewalk, he has the rights and duties of a pedestrian. And so a driver pulling out from a driveway, that driver would be at fault for not yielding to the pedestrian, the bicyclist approaching on the sidewalk. So when we do this crash typing, we're looking at not only the location, but again, that position that the cyclist is in prior to the crash, what direction are they going relative to traffic, and then who initiated, whose behavior initiated that crash, whether or not they were necessarily at fault. So if we break it down to broad categories of crash types, you start off looking at just all injury levels. You notice at the top of the chart there, overtaking motorist only accounts for 6% of the crashes. We look at other motorist-caused crashes, they're about 60%, where those motorists turning and crossing the path of the cyclist. And notice that when you look at motorist-caused crashes down there at the lower left of the screen, 3/4 of them involve cyclists on sidewalks and paths. Now, this is all crashes overall. We'll get into the more severe ones in a bit. And then the other, roughly 1/4 of the crashes involve the bicyclist's failure to yield, turning or crossing the path of the motorist. So as we move up to the more severe, KSI meaning killed or serious injury, we see that overtaking becomes a bigger proportion. Motorist failure to yield starts to decrease while bicyclist failure to yield increases. And that's because we're talking about more mid-block locations with the bicyclist crossing where motorists are moving fast. And then if we move on to fatalities, but overtaking becomes a much bigger portion at 22%. Motorist failure to yield is a much smaller part of it. And then about half of the fatalities involving the bicyclist failure to yield, again, the high-speed motorist, often at night. So reducing motorist speeds, would impact, again, those half of the crashes that are the bicyclist failure to yield, and the nearly 1/4 that are the overtaking crashes. getting a little deeper into that speed and darkness element, we took our crash data and our count data and looked at just the streets without bike lanes and paved shoulders. We did see a reduction in overtaking crashes, as you might imagine, with bike lanes and paved shoulders. But let's just look at the speed and darkness. So the orange bars here are roads with 40 to 45 mile an hour posted speed, and the green ones are 25 to 35. And see, you can see the risk here by crashes per million bicyclist miles traveled. And what I want to draw your attention to is comparing a daytime low speed risk for a serious injury or fatality to a nighttime high speed. We see here that it's 37 times greater to be on a nighttime high speed road. Now, part of this has to do with bicyclist conspicuity. And we don't have very good data on this. Very often, the crash report is silent as to what type of lights or reflectors. But we know that a significant portion do involve cyclists that are not as well lit or reflectorized as they could be. So again, bringing motorist speeds down has a really important impact on reducing bicyclist fatalities and serious injuries, as it does for pedestrians as well. So is separation a solution? Well, from our counts, about 70% of bicyclists are already using separated facilities. A sidewalk is a separated facility. It may not be designed for bicyclists, but it functions pretty much the same as if it were widened out to a shared use path. But as I noted earlier, 3/4 of our crashes also involve those separated cyclists, and about 60% of the serious crashes. Once again, looking at the People for Bikes data, the same 10 cities that we looked at earlier, now looking at fatalities. We can't look at crashes overall. There's no good source for that, but there is a national fatal accident reporting system. And so we got the fatal crashes for the years 2013 through 17 and 2018 through 22. And then normalize those by looking at the commute rates. So we actually got a crash rate for each of those. And we see that actually on the whole, for those 10, the crash rates went up about 12%. There were a couple of cities where we saw a decline in New York and San Francisco. New York is notable in that one of the key things they did was they reduced their operating speeds of motor vehicles. If you've been to New York, they have those long boulevards where they're one-way streets, and they had signal timed so that everybody can really keep flowing through. Well, they used to be timed at fairly high speeds. They've reduced them to like 25 or 30 miles an hour. So when you've got that signal progression that keeps the drivers from going too fast, and I would think that has certainly been a component of their crash reduction, their fatality reduction, especially. And then once again, bringing Orlando into the mix here by comparison. And you can see that the city has had a similar increase. All right, and so we will take another break here for Q&A. Any questions or comments?
Yes, Mike, this is Judy Pizzo. I'm confused regarding the number of accidents, even when the cyclist is in a separated facility. What's the cause again behind that? You'd have the sense of false security if you were in a separated lane or literally a cycle track where there might be a barrier between you and the traffic.
Right, but at every driveway and every intersection, there are going to be vehicles crossing that path. And so depending on how that traffic is managed, can determine, as well as other factors such as the cyclist speed and direction, can all have an impact on crash risk, especially, again, cyclists going against the flow of traffic. Bicyclists going facing traffic on the sidewalk is our #1 crash by far, because the motorist who's coming out from a side street or a driveway is looking to the left while the cyclist is coming from the right. Now, it does tend to be a lower speed crash because the motorist is, coming out from a stop. And so it tends not to be as severe, but it still happens. There was just this month, I believe, there was a fatality in Seminole County involving just this type of crash. It's not the dominant type of fatality, but it does occur.
Thank you for the clarification.
All right. Anyone else? All right. Well, I'm going to talk about speed a little more, as I had alluded to earlier. A few months ago, I was I review crashes on a regular basis as part of this crash typing analysis. And I was actually getting ready to do a presentation for Florida Bicycle Association on e-bikes when I came upon a crash that I'm actually illustrating for you right here. This is on West Colonial. And the driver in the red van there in the turning lane, the turning cut, is getting ready to go across. You see all the stopped traffic. And then there was a bicyclist coming on the bike lane. It was actually an e-bike rider who actually reported his speed at being about 25 miles per hour. And this was the result. The motorist could not see the approaching bicyclist because of stopped traffic, and the bicyclist couldn't see the motorist for that same reason. And so we have a blind situation compounded by the high speed of the cyclist. So we actually were able to quantify this risk factor using our MyoVision cameras and our crash data. We looked at the speed for travel lane cyclists, bike lane cyclists, and sidewalk riders. So by 85th percentile, what I mean is that up to 85% of the cyclists are going at that speed or lower. So for travel lane cyclists, 18.5 miles per hour is the 85th percentile. And at that speed, a cyclist needs about 100 feet of stopping distance. And you see the crash risk there based on the exposure data that we have, about 16 crashes per million miles. For bike lanes, a little bit slower cycling speed and a little bit lower crash risk. And then for sidewalk cyclists, slower still at 12.5 miles per hour. And the average you see, they're only about 9.5 miles per hour. And you can see that the risk there is about half of that of travel lane cyclists. And this is just looking at the turning and crossing movement crashes for cyclists going with the flow of traffic. So it doesn't look at overtaking crashes, doesn't involve cyclists going against the flow. So just isolating for the cyclist speed and position, we see this kind of outcome. So really, it's not that the sidewalk makes or the bike lane makes the cyclist safer. It's that the cyclist makes those facilities safer because they are slower. And so that when a motorist violates their right of way, they don't need the stopping distance that a faster cyclist would need. So why is this important? Well, it's because this is where 60% of our crashes happen and 40% of our KSI crashes. So bicyclist speed is at least a potential factor for a significant portion of our crashes. So what if we move faster bicyclists off the roadway and onto a side path or a sidewalk? Well, that's actually what's happening right now with e-bikes. It's not so much that we're moving them, it's just that the sidewalk riders are getting faster. Well, before the advent of e-bikes, we were doing a study on Silver Star Road, across the board traffic safety study. And I was looking at the bike and pedestrian crashes along this corridor. And one thing that jumped out at me was a bunch of right hook crashes. So a right hook is where the motorist and the bicyclists are going the same direction, and the motorist turns right across the path of the bicyclist that they just passed. And typically, this is actually a very low risk crash for sidewalk riders because they have plenty of time to react and they're not going very fast. And so it doesn't happen very often. But here we had quite a cluster of right hook sidewalk crashes, which got me scratching my head until I realized, oh, there are hills on Silver Star Road, unlike most of the bigger 6-lane arterials in our area. So I looked at where these crashes happen in relation to the hills, and sure enough, virtually all of them involved a downhill bicyclist. There was one travel lane cyclist you see called out there, and there was one other right hook that didn't involve a downhill cyclist. But that cluster that you see of 3 there in the center, again, those are all coming downhill, and all the others really. And so I put my myovision cameras out to see what the sidewalk speeds were like for these cyclists. And so found that they were going 30 to 45% faster than cyclists on level ground on similar arterial roads. When I say 30 to 45, it's 30% for the average and 45% for the 85th percentile. So what does that get us from a crash risk standpoint? Well, it meant that the crash risk went up 15-fold for right hook crashes, just by cyclists being a few miles per hour faster. And the overall crash risk for cyclists going with the flow of traffic was 7 times greater. So increasing the speed of sidewalk riders is going to increase our overall crash risk. This was something I discovered a few months ago. Someone had shared this online. We are doing a study with Seminole County right now using traffic cameras at traffic signals to do close call analysis using artificial intelligence, identifying close calls. Well, this is the analog low-tech close call analysis where you can see all the skid marks of the bicyclists who are trying to avoid a crash. So you can see that potentially we've got that right hook situation. So what the design we're looking at here is, if we were designing a road, we would never do lanes like that graphic is illustrating there, right? We would never have motorists on the inside lane turning right across the path of motorists who could go straight, right? But that's exactly what this scenario does for bicyclists. And this wouldn't be an issue if we were talking about pedestrian speeds. A pedestrian going 3 to 6 feet per second only needs a few feet to come to a stop, but a bicyclist can be going 12 to 30 feet per second and needs a lot more stopping distance. And so this is why the problem is what it is. And then where I would be as a trained cyclist is out here in the regular travel lane. Of course, I'd probably be getting a lot of grief from the motorists who think I'm supposed to be in the bike lane. But that's a conversation for another day. But anyway, this is just an illustration of some of the issues that can come into play when we have bicyclists separated and when their speeds are part of the problem. We don't have really clear data yet on motorized bicycles. We will in the coming year. We're getting an update to our crash analysis tool online that will enable us to do a better analysis. So the table that you see here for the years 2023 and 24, those are estimates of the percentage of crashes that involve a motorized bicycle. For prior years, we do actually have those numbers, and you can see they're very small, under 2%, virtually zero for many of the years. And then the dark blue line is just the overall crashes for all bikes. And what's interesting is that it's been since COVID where the big increase has come with e-bikes, and we've seen now over 20% increase in overall bike crashes compared to pre-COVID years. that corresponds well with the rise in e-bikes. Again, we'll have better detail on the types of crashes that e-bike riders are getting into, in about a year, or later this year, as we do this analysis. So how can an e-bike rider or any fast cyclist remedy that problem? If you're going to ride fast, it's really important that you use what I was referring to earlier as the driver position or lane control. By being in the center of the lane, the cyclist doesn't have to worry about the right hook conflict. Drive out conflicts are reduced because of much greater improved line of sight. And that improves the line of sight both for the cyclist and for the motorist. And then, like the opposing left turn, the cyclist has a lot more maneuverability to avoid conflicts. And this also improves with overtaking crashes, because the majority of overtaking crashes are sideswipe crashes where the motorist misjudges the passing clearance. And so by being in the center of the lane, it greatly reduces the overtaking crash as well. All right, and so let's do another break here. I see a couple of questions.
Yeah, Mike, we had a few things in the chat. Patricia was asking about the location of that right hook cyclist crash, local crash that you pointed out. She wondered if it was Silver Star and Powers Drive. Was
Yes.
that the?
Yes, just east of Powers Drive on Silver Star.
Yeah, we had another question from someone asking if the slides were going to be available. I know, I mean, obviously our video, as we mentioned, is going to be available. Were you going to make those slides available at this time, or?
I think we could do that. I'd have to see about, it could be,
I think we
it works
might be
better as a
able.
because of the animations, it works better as a PowerPoint
Yeah.
than as a PDF. We'll have to think about how we want to
Okay.
provide this.
In the meantime, Rosemary, the video will be available for anybody.
Right.
And then I don't know if Mark wants to share a little more about this. He mentioned in the chat that he had a crash, didn't occur in Florida, but an overtaking crash with a car traveling at a pretty high rate of speed. And he was interested in some of our data breakdowns on that. Mark,
Yeah.
did you want to say more about that? He says there's not much to say except he spent a couple of months in the hospital. So, as he mentioned,
we can.
That
we
was
can
a
all
life changing.
just barely imagine, what
Yeah.
what that would mean. But what I would say is, that our focus, because we're in urban areas, predominantly on urban crashes, and there's a big difference between rural and urban. And rural is really where the separation really does become a benefit, because you don't have all those points of conflict. You do have higher speeds. It's a lot easier for a driver on a high-speed road, especially one that's fairly straight and flat, to not pay attention. So, the context is really important. As the speed goes up, separation becomes more effective. The thing that you really don't want is combination of high speed and high conflict. You've got to get rid of one or the other in order to improve your safety. So, yeah.
Mike, I had a question. The photo that you had with the Walgreens and the near miss photo.
Right.
I noticed in that photo the signage. There's a sign for turning vehicles. If you see that, yeah, it's to the right of the travel lane, right? So the motorists, most of us are predominantly motorists, and if you're approaching this intersection, you're looking at the light. That's what you're always looking at.
Mhm.
right? And you know, I'm curious why the sign is on the right, why there's no right turn on red. You know, it's
Mhm.
like, so there's some signage coordination. You know, I think like the bicyclists don't get treated, you know, on the same level as the motorist here, and you can see that with the signage. And then I guess another question, so there's a specific questions about this intersection, but I know that there's a lot of other places where there's not a lot of right turns on red as a policy.
All right, so let me explain here. You get a good point about the signs. I mean, it would be more effective, for example, if they were in that divider between the travel and the bike lane. However, right hooks are primarily, first off, they're not a right on red problem. Okay, unless the bicyclist is violating the red light. If the bicyclist is crossing the road, that's not by definition a right hook crash. Right hooks tend to be on the stale green. In other words, basically the signal has been green for at least 5 seconds or so, and all the traffic is already moving. And it's particularly a problem when the motor vehicle traffic is moving somewhat slower and the bicyclist is going faster and passing that vehicle traffic. And so both parties have a green light, both are allowed to go forward, but the situation is that the driver has to check and clear that bike lane before proceeding. The sign might help on that, but one of our principles in Vision Zero is that human beings make mistakes, and so it's a mistake that happens all too often. And so my perspective as a cyclist is that I'm going to be a defensive driver, and I'm just not going to put myself in that position to be right hooked if I can help it, which is to be over there using the regular travel lane. Or that if I'm going to use this bike lane, I need to understand that I can't be going 15 miles an hour. I really need to be going less than 10 miles an hour in order to avoid that conflict.
Thank you.
Welcome.
I don't see any more hands or comments. Anybody else? Jump in. Feel free, folks. And jump in if you have anything to say.
All right, I think I'll move on to our final section here to talk about reducing risk. Back to my comparison of Orlando and Amsterdam. So I showed you those conflict risk factors earlier. That when we're looking at conflict frequency. In Orlando, you're going to have a lot of commercial driveways, unsignalized intersections. It's a more suburban type of environment. Whereas in Amsterdam, more of the intersections are either signalized or are roundabouts. You don't have a lot of driveways. Commercial access tends to be on side streets. And so that inherently reduces the amount of complex or makes the complex more manageable. With motor vehicle volumes, again, another risk factor there, that here we're looking at roads in the range of 30 to sometimes over 50,000 cars per day. Whereas in Amsterdam, the highest traffic amount I saw was 25,000. Most of their streets are under 20,000 cars per day. Motor vehicle speed, this is a huge one, especially when it comes to serious injuries and fatalities. We have a lot of roads posted at 40 to 50. In Amsterdam, it's a citywide speed limit of 30 miles per hour, and their neighborhood streets are posted at 20. Bicyclist direction. Here, nearly half of our cyclists are going facing traffic on the sidewalk. In Amsterdam, I've been there, I've biked there. It's really difficult to ride facing traffic because you've got a steady stream of other bicyclists coming at you, and they are going to let you know that you should not be going against the flow of traffic. Also, the Dutch stopped doing bidirectional bike facilities many years ago, they recognized the inherent risk of having cyclists going against the flow traffic. And so they really saved those for either rural roads or for roads that don't have a lot of conflict points, such as along waterfronts. Bicycle speeds are really not very different there and here, roughly around the 10 miles per hour. Probably both have increased because of the advent of e-bikes. And also bicyclist lateral position really isn't all that different between here and there, because most of our cyclists are using a sidewalk and most of the cyclists in Amsterdam are using a separated facility specifically for bikes. And then the last factor is visibility and conspicuity. In the Netherlands, you are required by law to have a bicycle on your bike at all times. It doesn't have to be on, but it has to be attached. Headlight and taillight have to be permanently attached. Whereas in the US, it's inconsistent. It's up to the user to determine where and when they want a light on their bike. And they will, in Amsterdam, they will pull someone over and cite them for not having a light on their bike, even during the daytime. I want to get a little more into some of our local crash risk data. We're able to look at just crashes overall, irrespective of who was at fault. Starting at the bottom of this chart here, you see where there's no bike facility, about 36, 37 crashes per million miles. And then you see the KSI in the right-hand column. Not a whole lot of difference with bike lanes. Now with side paths, what I had to do is really split them out, because there were some side paths that had very few conflict points, and you see that they also had very low crash risk. And then you had some paths that had a lot of conflict points. So here's what I mean. The high conflict paths had about 12 intersections or commercial driveways per mile, whereas the low conflict paths were only at about 5. Those high conflict paths were comparable to the roads with no bike facilities as far as the number of conflict points. But what's interesting is they actually had higher crash risks. Overall higher crash rate, even the serious crashes, it was a higher risk. Well, why is that? Well, side paths, particularly when they are popular ones, are going to attract faster cyclists. Those recreational cyclists who are riding a road bike and have a little more skill and fitness, they're adding to the speed. And we actually saw that in our data, that side path users were on the whole faster than regular sidewalk riders. You combine that with going facing traffic and the frequent conflict points, and you end up with a higher crash risk. Another thing we need to think about is when we're trying to reach motorists and cyclists, let's think about what their current expectations are. These are the mode splits for Amsterdam and Orlando. You can see here that bicyclists actually outnumber autos, right, in Amsterdam, right? So only 20% of trips are by auto, where here it's over 90%, and bicyclists that are roughly 0.5%. So what this means is that in Amsterdam, a motorist is going to see 1.5 bicyclists for every motorist that they see. And on average, they're probably seeing a bicyclist every 20 seconds. Compare that to Orlando. Motorist is going to see 155 other motor vehicles for every bicyclist they see. And a bicyclist is only come by once every 30 to 45 minutes. So it's really important when if we're going to try to change expectations, to think about where we're starting from and how difficult it can be to get someone to change their how they scan when we're only asking them to look for something that comes by, once every half hour or so. I mentioned earlier about cyclist training, and cyclist position, roadway position is a key component of what effective training does. And these are some slides actually from that Cycling Savvy course I don't think there's anyone online here today who's taken it, but there are actually a couple of CAC members who have taken the course. It's a 10-hour course. It has classroom, bike handling skills, and then we actually take people out on the road for a tour to put it all together in the real world. So what this slide is showing is two cyclists that you see over on the very left-hand side of the graphic. The one highlighted in red is I call an edge rider, riding along the right-hand edge of the travel lane, and the one in green being in that lane control position. Well, let's look at the conflicts that edge rider is going to have to deal with. There's the right hooks, there's drive outs, there's opening car doors, vehicles pulling out of parking spaces. In the center there, that's actually a wrong way cyclist that could actually pose a risk to the correct direction cyclist. That big truck making a right turn at the intersection. You see the bulb out there where the bus stop is. That would create a pinch point with the cyclist who is using that space, but all of a sudden the curb is protruding out. So a lot of potential conflicts there. Whereas there are some conflicts for the cyclist who's in that lane control position, but the ones that do remain are really minimized because the cyclist has a better line of sight. When I talk to cyclists, and you've probably heard this as well, a lot of cyclists, particularly the ones who ride on the road, they have their stupid motorist story. Every time they go out for a ride, they come back and they share a motorist. So you wouldn't believe what this stupid motorist did. I don't have those stupid motorist stories. And that's because I'm the cyclist in green. By being in that position, as well as some other skills, but that's the core thing. It greatly reduces the amount of conflicts. Now, some of those conflicts would be reduced by the cyclist moving from the edge of the road, say, onto the sidewalk, and that's why a lot of them do. But it doesn't eliminate them. And again, particularly if they're a fast cyclist, then they're still going to have the stupid motorist stories. So understanding the benefit of training for cyclists, I think is really important. So getting into a little bit of review here, overall, for bicycling use, increased cycling is primarily driven by land use and geography and demographics. Bicyclist crash risk, we have to look at conflict points, bicyclist direction, motorist speed and darkness for the more severe crashes, and then bicyclist speed and their lateral position for the motorist failure to yield crashes. So if we're looking at risk reduction, what can we do? From an infrastructure standpoint, our key focus really should be on reducing motorist speeds. That's going to give us the greatest impact, or reduced impact, for serious and fatal crashes. And along those higher speed, low conflict corridors, that's where separated facilities can be useful and improve safety. But let's not forget the bicyclist behavior. Having cyclists understand they need to go with the flow of traffic, even if the law allows them to go against the flow on the sidewalk. They need to understand this relationship between the environment they're riding in and their speed and the conflicts, and ensuring that they are conspicuous based on the circumstances that they're in. And I want to leave you with one last thought here. Just for comparison, I took a look at the cost of the shared use paths that we are building in our area through our transportation improvement program. And on average now, it's costing about 3 million miles to build a shared use path. And many of these are side paths, adjacent to a roadway. Now, I want to estimate the cost of cyclist education here. And it's really hard to get people to take a bike safety course. Most people don't know what they don't know, or they think, I'm safe, what do I need a safety course for? It's the motorists that need a course. Well, what if we paid people to take a course? If I was able to pay them $15 an hour to take a 10-hour course, we might get some takers for that. And then we'd need some additional funding for paying our instructors and marketing, et cetera. we could reach 10,000 bicyclists for $3 million. And think about what the impact would be of that. Spread 10,000 highly trained cyclists throughout a region. So anyway, food for thought. And so I think the key takeaway from today is that both the choice to bike and the risk for cycling are affected by a plethora of factors, not just bicyclist accommodation. So it's the behavior and the context and the design altogether. And that's our wrap up. Now, you're welcome to take any final questions or have some more discussion.
We had a comment in the chat from Mark saying that he's surprised at how much, as he puts it, hate cyclists get from drivers on social media, that is just sort of have become a target in some social media environments, which is sad to see. I was at a community event yesterday in which a woman shared with me that her son is a cyclist and all the time feels that he's sort of treated as if he doesn't have a place on the road, shouldn't be out there. He's just in the way of the motorist, and that's just an attitude that needs to change.
Mm-hmm.
And we at Metro Plan Orlando, always try to make that point that that cycling is a mode of travel that we need.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to accommodate.
Well, I think the key problem is that most motorists, as well as most cyclists, don't understand that lane control is a defensive driving strategy, right? So, you wouldn't criticize your fellow motorists for driving defensively. We shouldn't be criticizing bicyclists for driving defensively. But most people don't understand that. They think that the bicyclist is just being obnoxious for no good reason. But no, cyclists who are riding in the center of lane are doing so to maximize their safety, as well as their mobility. Judy, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Mike. Great presentation. And to follow up on what both of you have said, from my past experience with dealing with the public, I think it's a lack of education on the part for the public that cyclists have every right to share the road, to be out there on the road. I was met with a lot of pushback when it was suggested, in some of the projects I had to have a lane for the cyclists. I've even friends that don't understand the cyclists can be out there, and have had rather interesting conversations with those same friends as to why a bicycle may be their only mode of transportation. So we have to consider that as well. But again, a great presentation, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Well, I think the thing about the shortcoming that I've seen with, as far as arguing that the bicyclist has a right to be on the road, I've been through these conversations with people for years and years and years. The response back is that, well, you may have the right, but you'll be dead right. We have to get past that for people to understand that, no, the cyclist is not in the road just because they're allowed to be. They're in the road because it's actually the safest place for them to be. That's the only way you change the conversation. And they need to understand why the cyclist is safer on the road. Now, some cyclists, if you're a slower cyclist, if you're a 10-mile-an-hour cyclist, the sidewalk is fine. And I'm not going to say that all cyclists should be out on the road, but all cyclists should have the opportunity to use the road, because it should be up to them to determine, based on their speed and the context, what's the safest position for them to be in, and not to be dictated as to where they should be.
Anybody else? Any other comments, questions? Okay. Well, I really want to thank everybody for coming today, and I am so particularly impressed by our wonderful new members. We had I just want to call you out again: Torin, Sheba, Patricia, John, Clyde, Amy, and Adam. That that's wonderful. We can't wait to have you join in more activities with the Community Advisory Committee. And in that vein, I will say that that I will be reaching out to new members with some more information at the end of this week and in advance of our April 23rd meeting. But you will also be receiving an invitation to another event, which our longer term members are familiar with, and that is our upcoming Metropolitan Transportation Plan Summit, which is on April 9th. That's an in-person meeting at the Lake Mary Event Center. And you will receive an invitation and some more explanation about our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, which wraps in all methods of transportation and how we're looking over the next 25 years. So you may or may not be able to attend that, new members, but if you can, you may feel like you're drinking from a fire hose, but we will certainly let you know details on that, and if you're able to make it, that'll be great. Then we'll have our new member orientation and in advance of our regular meeting on April 23rd. And if there's nothing further, I guess we're done. Thanks, Mike. I think this was a great time that we spent together, and you will certainly see Mike again with his safety moment and other reports of Vision Zero and everything else as we continue with our CAC meeting. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great day. And we'll be
Thanks,
talking
everyone.
to you soon.